Hello everyone and welcome to episode 2 of the Chase Life podcast with Rachel and David Godfrey. Now today we are going to talk about something that's a little bit of a contentious topic, and that is counting calories and tracking macros, specifically about how this relates to binge and emotional eating, because a lot of the clients that come to us think that they need to track everything really, really closely, and that's going to keep control of their binge and emotional eating, when actually it can make things infinitely worse. So we're going to dive in here and, talk a little bit about the practicalities of this and the mindset of it. Because the reality is that, look, we cannot get away from the science. Calories do matter. Of course they do. But this is a behavior that I want to call out. Now, here's the thing. Tracking calories and macros obsessively and sticking them into a little app is frankly not life enhancing. Look, we work with a lot of highly driven professionals who are very, very busy. Look, I'm a mother of 2. I can tell you now, I do not have time, nor do I have the will or the want to, count every grain of rice that I eat and then track it in a little app. I just don't have time for this stuff. Now, yes, calories do matter, and tracking your calories and macros, of course, there is a place for it. But the problem is that we are using a short-term solution or a short-term tool to manage long-term behavior. And this is where the problem is, right? So how do we start addressing this? Let's talk about it from a behavioral perspective, first of all. Yeah.
Like you say, it's one of the biggest issues that leads to binge eating, a disordered relationship with food. And it's such in terms of using it to get results, it's such an advanced strategy that it's such overkill for almost everybody beyond perhaps hardcore bodybuilders and elite athletes competing in a weight class. Yeah. Exactly. And so I think it's really important for people to understand the psychological impact of counting calories and how that then leads to binge eating. So there's a whole bunch of different directions that we can go with this. So one of the first ways that counting calories is going to cause binge eating is creating perfectionism. It breeds this mindset of all or nothing. Because now that somebody has this belief that things need to be controlled to that degree of precision, now there's an elevated fear of losing control. And it amplifies these feelings of being restricted, being boxed in, needing to control things to these minuscule degrees with no room for error. And as a result, that internal pressure of feeling confined, feeling restricted, feeling like you're missing out builds and builds and builds, and eventually it pops out in something. And what ends up happening is people go through these bigger and bigger swings from on the wagon, off the wagon. So the way that I like to explain to people how calorie counting can contribute to binge eating is an analogy that I like to call the tightrope analogy. So if you imagine, instead of it being a tightrope, let's just use a plank, right? So it's a plank, and imagine it's about 2 meters long and it's wide enough to get both your feet on it comfortably. Now, imagine that plank flat on the ground, totally flat on the ground, and I ask you to walk from one end to the other. How confident are you that you can walk across that plank from one end to the other without falling off? Pretty confident, right? It's going to be pretty easy. You're not even going to be thinking about falling off. What are you thinking about? You're thinking about get to the end. You're just going to look at the end of the plank, get to the end of the plank, 1 foot in front of the other, job done. Really comfortable, really easy. Now, let's put that plank between 2 skyscrapers. Same length, 2 meters. Everything else is the same. The plank's nice and rigid. It's not wobbly. It's not going to go anywhere. But you've got to do exactly the same exercise. Walk from one end of the plank to the other. Now how are you going to feel? Now what are you thinking about? Now what are you focusing on? Now instead of focusing on the end of the plank and just 1 foot in front of the other and just getting on with the task at hand, now you're thinking, don't look down, don't fall off, don't lose your balance. Have I started to lose my balance? Oh my God, I can feel myself wobbling. Is that going to lead to me falling?
So here's the thing, right? If I put myself in that perspective, and I can relate this to counting calories as well, or tracking your macros in, I don't know, MyFitnessPal or whatever it is. So if I were just about to walk out onto a plank of 2 skyscrapers, I would instinctively go, nah, I ain't doing it. And that's exactly what people do with tracking calories and macros. You know, they might have started, they might have done it before and then fallen off the wagon, and then they go to do it again, but there's this block there that's frankly fuck it, this is just all too hard. And so they never go ahead and do it anyway, because it can be a monumental pain in the ass. Now, you know, people say, well, no, it's a really flexible way of eating. It's a really easy way of doing it. Really? Because honestly, you know, when we're working with really high performing driven people, like often just spending 30 seconds of tracking your food and to then go into shaming somebody for not tracking their food. Hang on a minute, let's address that and call out that behavior, because I think one of the reasons why people love to track calories and macros is because it is a system that can work, right? And it does, because calories in and calories out does matter. But using it for long-term behavior, and this is where we have to address that. So, sorry, I cut you off then with your tightrope analogy. But aside from this, you know, I'm not even doing it, and if I do it, then I'm always worried about something else, leading to perfectionism. What else is there? Yeah,
so, well, with the tightrope analogy, the point of that being that the greater the degree of control and precision that you need to have, the greater the fear of losing control. Right? So when you're walking across the plank at ground level, then you believe that you have a greater margin for error, and there's no fear of losing control, because, well, if I do lose my balance a little bit, like, what's the worst that can happen? I step off onto the grass. But when you're between 2 skyscrapers, what's the worst that can happen? I plummet to my death.
But that's how people feel.
Exactly.
I really feel for people who have been struggling for many, many years, actually, with not just binge and emotional eating, but, you know, with weight loss. Weight loss is really quite straightforward and quite simple. But the reality is that it does feel like life and death for people. And, you know, for some people listening to this, like, that might be a little bit of an overreaction for you, but for others, it's not. It really does mean that much. So when David says, you know, it feels like plunging to your death, like falling from a skyscraper, that's how much it means to people. And that's how much people have struggled sometimes. So I think that's really important to address. Yeah,
for sure. And what that then leads to is something that I call the tightening of the binge eating cycle. So somebody starts out with a belief that in the past, whenever I have lost weight successfully, and I put successfully in inverted commas, because sure, they lost weight, but it didn't last, right? And they haven't actually equated that one of the reasons why they lose control is because of this excessive precision and perfectionism and so forth. But they label it as a success. And so in the past, when I have lost weight successfully, albeit temporarily, it was with a lot of discipline and a lot of control. So clearly the thing that's missing for me is even more discipline, is even more control. So they tighten things even more. So they get even more perfectionist. They count their calories precisely at every single meal. They weigh everything. They leave no stone unturned. They make sure that every single meal is planned in detail in advance, etc., etc., etc. But then, of course, that leads to a building of all of that internal psychological pressure that we described earlier, leading to that fuck it moment. And then it leads to an all-out binge. And now when it starts with something like, I'll just have a taste of something, or it starts with some kind of situation where now you don't have perfect control. You're at a works function and you don't have your regular food available or whatever it is. So now, because you can't get it perfect, well, what's the point? So then that escalates, it's a bad day now. And that's one of the things that counting calories can often lead people to, that perfectionism, that all or nothing mindset. Now you see food as good food and bad food. Now it's a good day or a bad day. And now that it's a bad day, well, what's the point? All bets are off. I might as well binge and start again tomorrow, start again on Monday. So it leads to that binge. And then they have the rebound. Then they have the regret, the remorse. And then they go back to square one again, which is, clearly what's missing is even more discipline, is even more precision. What's wrong with me? Why can't I do this? I need to exercise even more willpower, etc., etc. So they tighten it even more. They get their perfectionism even tighter. And so the swings get more and more aggressive. But what's interesting is that for some people, what this can then lead to is the duration with which they can be, as they label it, good, becomes shorter and shorter. And the duration of being off the wagon or bad gets longer and longer and longer. Right? Many people have had the experience, and this is not always the case for everybody, but many people have the experience of they go on their very first body transformation and they can stick it out for 3 months, but they're gradually learning to hate the process. And so then they have their rebound, and then after that, they think, right, that works the first time around, so I need to do it again. And then now they can only do it for a month. And then they can only do it Monday to Friday, and they're binging every weekend. Then they're binging every evening. Then they're binging in the middle of the day. And also, they can't get themselves motivated to do it again. Why? Because their brain is going, please don't make me do it again. I hate it.
I think that's really common with 12-week body transformations. This is certainly true. Like if people have been competing, bikini competitions, figure competitions, and, bodybuilding competitions in general, you wait until the end. And so especially if it's your first prep and your first comp, or the first time that you've done a body transformation, you can usually stick it out with willpower in the beginning because the end is coming and the end is in sight. But then what happens when you're unleashed on the real world? What happens when you go back to the office and there's only 2 sandwiches at your conference? What happens when you get home and there's hardly any food in the house and you've got to have porridge for dinner instead of your planned, steamed fish and broccoli? Well, all bets shouldn't be off. You should be able to learn to do life. And so this is something that we see so commonly. And, life is not about one big long diet and one big long body transformation. And something that I was talking about the other day with a client is that women in particular are obsessed with fat loss. But just to add in here, your metabolism loves small fluctuations in caloric intake. Some days are going to be less, some days are going to be more. Your metabolism is not fixed. And I say to clients all the time, you're not a robot. You don't need exactly 1,700 calories a day. And by the way, I say 1,700 calories. It's not a magic number. It's just a number I just thought of. Because if I say 1,700 calories and I give a macro split, I'm sure somebody's going to go away and actually implement that and, think that that's the magic number for fat loss. It is not. It depends on so many things. So how do we get away from this? Like, how do we start implementing more of a lifestyle nutrition?
So I think there's a few things that we need to start teaching people. And one of them is to start learning to think for themselves. So another problem caused by counting calories is that it teaches a distrust and a disassociation from your body and from yourself and your own decision making. So let me explain that. So when it comes to from your body, the message that you're unconsciously sending to yourself is your body is wrong, your body can't be trusted, you know what's right for it, tell it what to do. Do not deviate, follow the numbers at all costs. So you're on your menstrual cycle, or you've changed your training program and you suddenly do a really tough legs workout. And now your physical hunger and cravings go through the roof. Your appetite goes through the roof. And what do most people who are on a rigid calorie plan do? Panic. Oh my God, I can't go over the numbers, What if I eat too much? What if I get fat? What if I overdo it? So they don't. They ignore their body signals, ignore it until they can't ignore it any longer. And then what happens? Full-blown binge again. So that's how it teaches a distrust of the body. And then it also teaches a distrust of yourself, because now you can't think for yourself. Now you need rigid rules or numbers, or worse, somebody else to tell you what to do in every single eventuality of life. And so now you have a complete inability to think for yourself or to navigate the grey areas of life, of which there are many. And so one of the things that we need to start reintroducing into how we work with clients is teaching them how to think for themselves. And there are going to be questions or situations in life where the answer is always, it depends. And the only person who can answer that is you, the person doing it for themselves.
So this is the problem with, if you're rigidly tracking your calories and your macros, and, let's just say that you're on the wagon and you think that you've got really good control over this now, it's not control, it's an illusion of control.
Yeah. 100%.
Because at any point in time, if one of these questions comes up, let's just say you've had a big leg day. Well, do I need permission from my coach to add more food in here? Like, I'm physically hungry. Should I just fight it out and just dig in with more willpower?
Yeah. And I think it might also be worth kind of, I guess, backtracking all the way back to the beginning here in terms of both you and I have been down the calories and macros and even more advanced nutritional strategies, like and something that we were discussing the other day, and you were giving some like really like specific intuitive advice to a client, and obviously I'm biased, but I genuinely believe that there's nobody out there better at this than you. But the way that you keep it super simple and just really smart, sensible, but also intuitive changes to somebody's diet and nutrition that are just so easy to implement. And so I guess it's interesting perhaps to discuss maybe the path that you've been down in terms of how you got to where you're at now, because you've been down that road of, really over-analyzing the science, making sure that every tiny little variable is controlled and tracked and so on. And so how did you come to where you are now?
Well, I think, with that client that we were talking about, that's what I would call the art of coaching. I've got 15 years experience in coaching, particularly women in fat loss, and especially corporate women and executives, high achievers and high performers. And I think that my skills there have been refined even more over the past sort of 7 to 10 years, when I myself have been extremely busy with, building businesses and obviously now having children. And my time has got shorter and shorter. And so therefore my ability to coach has actually got better as well, because I'm learning from myself and I'm learning from my clients. And so, when you've been working with lawyers and, people high up in finance, they don't have a lot of time in their days. And so you, as a coach and as a trainer, you have to get to know your clients really well. And this comes down to a relationship with the clients and, what works for them and what won't work for them. So with my journey, I started off as anybody does, starting tracking calories and macros. And look, tracking your calories and macros initially in the beginning can be a really good short-term education tool for somebody to actually understand what is in their food, because I do think that's important. So there is a time and a place for it, for you to know, okay, well, what does, a cup of rice, for example, get a cup and measure it. Or, what does 30 grams of protein look like? Look, it's worth weighing a chicken breast once to kind of get a visual eyeball of what you're working with. That's great, but we don't need to do it every single day for years and years and years on end. So look, that's how I started. I've been a competitor myself, believe it or not, back in the day. Oh my gosh. We're going back a very long time now, people. Certainly a good, oh my gosh, 10 years ago, maybe, I did step on stage as a bikini competitor, and honestly, I hated it. We'll go into that in a different episode. I hated it for a multitude of different reasons, but mostly the reason I hated it the most was somebody telling me that my physique wasn't good enough when I knew I had a great physique. And I also was doing the wrong things for the wrong reason. One of the reasons that I got on stage was because it was suggested to me that it was a really good way to accelerate my career in the fitness industry. And I knew in my gut feeling that was not the case. But I went ahead and I did it anyway. And it's very unlike me to listen to somebody else, but I did it. And I hated the process. So we'll talk about that on another episode. But for sure, I've been down the tracking route. And quite honestly, as my business grew and I had less time, I started to find that this was, really becoming quite a pain in the ass. I've never had any emotional issues with food, so to speak, but I've been I'm a former perfectionist, stress addict, and a workaholic. And I can completely see even somebody who has, quite frankly, very little emotional attachment to food, how it can drive perfectionism around food. Even for somebody like me who is a little bit of a robot with food, it started to make me quite emotional around food. It did make me start to second guess myself and start to worry about what I was eating, and, when I, worry about my meal prep. And that's when I realized, actually, hang on a minute, there are definitely other ways of doing this. And obviously then, as my coaching progressed, as I progressed as a coach, that's where, I've got to today. And as well, training thousands of clients now, face-to-face and online, I have found much better results. Again, this comes with the art of coaching, with visual portion control and getting the clients to trust in themselves again.
Yeah. And I think that's where this has to also be backed up with some personal growth, right? Some mindset work, because in order to get somebody to let go of counting calories and to finally see that it's not control, it's just the illusion of control, and actually it's slowly and secretly and silently destroying their self-control behind the scenes. But obviously letting go of it is going to, for some people, create fear because they're stepping into the unknown. And very often when people are making decisions about what they're going to do next, or I say what they're going to do next, what they're going to do for the next meal even, is that people then look into the future and they try to predict what's going to happen, but they're trying to predict what's going to happen based off no actual experience or real world data. It's just based off a whole bunch of what if questions.
I think the biggest fear for women is like, what if I get fat? And actually, I'm just thinking about my journey now. I'm kind of like trying to rewind the clock 12 years. But I remember it would have been about a good 12, 13 years ago. I used to plan my days around my meals and around food rather than going out and, doing life. And look, for sure, like, food is important. And if you've got fat to lose, then yeah, you need to prioritize your meals, but it shouldn't be the single most important thing that you think about in that day.
Yeah.
But I certainly found myself, and I haven't really talked about this before, I guess it's just an idea that just came to me, a revelation, that I used to do that. I used to plan my days around my meals and around my food so that I could control that area of my life. And that's something that I haven't really talked about before, because I figured it was just, this was part of being a perfectionist, though, and doing a lot of perfectionism.
How does that relate in terms of, on the one end we've got perfectionism, which is fear driven, right? It's constantly asking questions like, what else is wrong, what else isn't good enough, and what could go wrong, and just constantly endless cycles of those kinds of questions. And as opposed to needing to be organized and needing to be structured, because let's be honest, like there are some people who are going for 6, 7, 8 hours without eating because it's just another meeting, and I've got this next thing to do and this next thing to do, and then they get to the end of the day, they're burnt out, they're exhausted, and then they make the excuse, or they justify or validate basically a binge because, I haven't eaten all day, so I've got calories to spare, so I'll have the pizza and I'll have the half a bottle of wine as well, because that's the only way I can wind down after a stressful day, etc. So yeah, where would you say the line lies between being organised and making sure actually you do eat at appropriate times versus being a perfectionist?
I think there's a very clear line, and this is what it is. It's about how you manage your state and your emotions throughout the entire day. And one of the things that you just said was, when you're coming from a place of perfectionism, it's fear driven. I remember 12 years ago, I would spend my day in fear that I would get something wrong. And that could be anything from not delivering a good enough personal training session, I think 12 years ago, I would have been, I can't remember what year it was, maybe I was at university back in Sydney doing my postgrad studies in sport and exercise science. Maybe it was that I wasn't achieving enough in that particular subject. It was that my food wasn't perfect, my training wasn't perfect, my hair wasn't perfect that day, my nails were perfect. It was everything. Whereas now, for sure, I prioritize my meals. Particularly now, I'm 13 weeks postpartum. I've got a body transformation that I'm getting stuck into, but it comes from a place of I get to do this. I don't have to do it. I get to do it, and I'm choosing to do it. And it is about being organized. And there is a distinct difference from living your life from a place of fear and always on edge. That's how I felt, always on edge. And I always felt like something was missing, and that thing that I was missing was a feeling of contentment and just relaxation. Whereas now, sure, I've got a business to run, I've got 2 kids to look after, and, I've got meal prep to do, etc., but it comes from a place of, okay, well, this is just what I do. And you're just managing your state the rest of the time, and that's the difference.
Yeah. I think you've hit the nail on the head there, because perfectionism is fear-based, and when people are constantly living in that place of fear, then they're also going to have a monumental fear of failure, and they're going to have a monumental fear of any form of mistake, because that means it's not going to work. That means I'm going to get fat. That means I'm doing it wrong. That means I'm going to get judged. And so as a result, people end up asking endless cycles of what-if questions. And so if they then make the decision or come to the realization, wow, actually, calorie counting isn't working for me. It is making all of these problems worse. I need to do something different. Well, guess what? Doing something different means stepping into the unknown. And then they're going to start asking all of these what if questions. What if I get fat? What if it doesn't work? What if I end up overeating? And then they make decisions around their food based off their imagination. And one of the things about the unconscious mind is that it doesn't know the difference between something that's being vividly imagined and something that's actually happening for real. That's why if you watch a horror movie, you jump, because unconsciously your brain doesn't realize you're not actually in the movie. So as a result, all of these imagined scenarios, what if I get fat? What if it doesn't work? If you ask those questions and play those movies over and over in your mind, then you end up actually convincing your mind that either has happened or is going to happen. So then people panic and go, I can't have that happen. And then they go back to what they were doing. And then they go to try their new thing for a couple of days, and then back to how they used to do things, and back and forth. And they're constantly second guessing everything, torn in 2 directions, loads of indecision. And then at the end of the process, they've no idea what's produced the results that they've achieved or haven't achieved.
And so this is, the next step for somebody is to step away from counting calories and tracking macros, is to look at your food and visual portion sizes. And we're using guidelines instead of rules. But the reality is that that's on paper, that's easy. But for a lot of people, that's really challenging for the reasons that you just discussed, where somebody is always second guessing themselves, or if somebody's struggling with binge eating, then they're never going to actually get a really clear picture of what's happening, because they have this fear of losing control and then go back to the tracking calories anyway. So in order to be able to move forward with something like this, yes, you have guidelines and visual portion sizes, and this is down to the individual to be able to create and build meals for yourself that satisfy your hunger, energy, and cravings, which is an acronym that our friend Jade Tita, came up with, which is such a useful strategy in order to be able to manage also a body transformation as well. So building meals in order to satisfy hunger, energy, and cravings. And we need to look longer term at this rather than just the short term of, have I been good in this day? We need to look at the long term behavior. And so one of the things that we do with our clients is go on a month by month strategy of looking at somebody's behavior over that. So behavior in the short term and, the results over the long term. So let's just say, you stop tracking your calories and your macros, and you're going to go now and look at, your visual portion sizes, and you're going to use, guidelines rather than rules. And at the end of a month, you've put on a little bit of weight and you've got a bit softer. Well, there's no need to freak out. That's okay. That's just feedback for you that, well, the next month, the next couple of weeks, I'm just going to perhaps slightly reduce my portion sizes, or I'm just going to slightly reduce my fat intake or slightly reduce my carb intake. And similarly, if you've lost a bit of muscle or you've dropped too much weight, well, okay, great. Then we get to perhaps increase carb servings. Perhaps we get to increase slightly all of your meals. But we don't need to react emotionally about it. And I think that's where a lot of people are making big mistakes, is that, they'll see the scales go up by, 500 grams, which, by the way, could mean the equivalent to a big poo or not. Let's be honest here. So we don't need to get overly emotional about these things. We need to look at it from a very objective, perspective of, okay, well, if I'm honest with myself, perhaps I did give myself a little bit too much freedom here. I had a binge here, or, I did emotionally eat there. Perhaps I didn't need to have the entire bottle of wine. And look at it from that bigger picture perspective.
Yeah, 100%. So I think in order to overcome the problem, then there's two key things that need to be addressed. One is we need to give people an approach to food and nutrition that works with their psychology instead of against it. Mm-hmm. And now, whilst making that change, whilst somebody continuing with counting calories and tracking things and perfectionism and so on is guaranteed to keep somebody stuck in binge eating and all their problems around food, making that change on its own, if they also struggle with all these mindset things, on its own isn't going to be enough. They have to start learning this kind of mindset that you've just discussed. And first and foremost, we have to eliminate emotion from food. Now, if somebody gets to that place, now we can live by what you said, which is track behavior short-term and results long-term. Because now there's not going to be any panic or knee-jerk reactions regardless of the results that you get at the end of, let's say, a 4-week block, because now you trust yourself. So if you decide on a specific pattern of eating and at the end of a month, you've plateaued, well, now it's just data and you can go, okay, great. What's the adjustment that I need to my pattern of eating in order to shift things in the next block? But now there's not going to be any sense of panic around it in terms of, I need to immediately get to, right, I'm going to drop my, I'm going to go back to calories, or I'm going to cut out sugar for a month, or I'm going to cut out carbs for a month, or whatever knee-jerk reaction somebody typically used to have. Now it's a case of, okay, cool. Now I can just make an appropriate adjustment. So emotional freedom around food requires tracking and regulating a pattern, not the minutiae. Right? You have to be able to be honest about what is the big picture pattern with the approach to food that you're taking, and are you being consistent with that? So it's about having a baseline lifestyle that you follow consistently. So we want to track patterns, not minuscule individual short-term details, whether it's one meal or even one day. We want to be able to track a long-term pattern. But again, it requires emotional growth, because some people are going to look at that and they're going to say, oh, okay, well, I'm going to eat 1,000 calories a day, Monday to Friday, and that way I can binge on the weekend, and the average pattern averages out. And no, it's about having a long-term average that is basically consistent 7 days a week. Mm-hmm. That's just how you do life. Why? Because there's no emotion around food. So now food is largely a functional thing, and that doesn't mean that you can't derive great enjoyment from food. We do. But first and foremost, it's a functional thing. That's just how you do life. Why? Because it's one of your highest values. Because health, fitness, well-being, and all of the value that living in this way adds to your life is so extraordinary. Why would you not do it every single day? Which I think is a complete wrap on this podcast. And so I guess to summarize everything that we've talked about today, we need to, if this is something that you're struggling with and you find yourself, tracking calories and macros, and that approach is just not working for you anymore, and it's something that is contributing to binge and emotional eating for you, then you do need to move towards more of a guidelines and a guidelines approach rather than having rigid rules.
and look at tracking behavior in the short term and results in the long term. So if this is something that you're struggling with and you're looking to take action right now to permanently overcome things like binge and emotional eating, low self-worth, confidence, or stress and overwhelm, then you can actually book into our diary and chat to us at chaselifeintensive.com/call. And of course, as always, if you have a question for the podcast, you can contact us on email, podcast@chaselifeconsulting.com. So that's a wrap for today. Please make sure to rate and review us and subscribe. And of course, tell only your best friends. And remember, chase life and always play beyond the rules.